Hello and welcome virtually to the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. My name is Christopher Sands, and I'm the director of our Canada Institute here at the Wilson Center. Today we'll be talking about Canada and Ukraine and the particular bond between these two countries. We have with us two expert analysts to talk a little bit about that relationship and how it bears on the current crisis in Ukraine. Professor Dominique Arel is an associate professor of political science and chair of Ukrainian studies at the University of Ottawa. He is also the organizer of the annual Danilev Research Seminar, I hope I said that correctly, on contemporary Ukraine, and has been organizing the seminar since 2005. Professor Arel also manages the Ukraine List, an internet academic current events newsletter that reaches over 1,500 subscribers in 35 countries. Dr. Jane Bolden is a professor at the Royal Military College of Canada and who has served as a consultant to the Department of National Defense, Department of Foreign Affairs, as well as a variety of research organizations and think tanks. She's been awarded funding from the United States Institute of Peace, the Carnegie Corporation of New York, and was a senior researcher on a project funded by the Ford Foundation. These two experts are no strangers to Washington audiences, but I'm particularly pleased that we were able to bring them through here to the Wilson Center via the magic of Zoom. Welcome, both of you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Let me start with you, Professor Arel. Some Americans may not know it, but Canada has the third largest Ukrainian population in the world after Ukraine, of course, and Russia. How did Ukrainians first come to Canada and why?
Yeah, there's kind of four waves of migration, of Ukrainian migration to Canada. The first two were essentially economic, and Ukrainians came from what is now Western Ukraine, but at that time, Western Ukraine was not part of the Russian Empire or the Soviet Union, but of the Austrian Empire or Poland in the interwar period. So from the 1890s through the 1920s, through the Depression, that was that economic migration. And most of them ended up in Western Canada, where they were needed as farmers. So it was like a farmer to farmer migration, contrary to the French-Canadian migration to New England was like agricultural to industrial. They went to the factories. So that's the first wave, not a political migration. And the level of Ukrainian national consciousness was in progress, let me put it that way. But after the Second World War, you had a massive migration from roughly the same areas of Western Ukraine, but this was a political migration. You had hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians who fled Soviet occupation, essentially. There was occupation started in 1939, then the Germans came in, and then the Soviet Union again in 1944. And they settled in these displaced camps in Germany and Austria. And after a while, a large number came to Canada, but not as farmers this time. They were like middle class, educated Ukrainians, and many settled in Toronto. So that kind of the center of gravity of Ukrainian migration shifted, but also this was a political migration, very much Ukrainian in national consciousness. And the last migration since the demise of the Soviet Union is from all over Ukraine in the last 30 years. We've got Ukrainians, maybe with a little disproportion from Western Ukraine, but you've got Russian-speaking Ukrainian, Ukrainian-speaking Ukrainians. So this is a rare case in Canadian history of, probably the only case really, of sustained migration over a century in different waves coming from Ukraine, one state, well, not one state, but a territory that eventually became one state.
Mm-hmm. And would you characterize the Ukrainian Canadian population as being affiliated with any of Canada's major political parties, or is this a cross-party ethnic group in terms of their activity in Canada?
Historically, the Liberal Party, which was kind of the dominant party in the early part of the 20th century, and then in the Trudeau years, but the Trudeau pair, like the Pierre Elliott Trudeau, an important constituency of the Liberal Party was recent immigrants, not just Ukrainians. So it was like in a sense, you can make it similar to the Democratic Party in the United States. The Conservative Party under Stephen Harper, so in the last decade, made serious inroads, and they really played what was called unofficially the ethnic vote, not just the Ukrainian, but targeting what we would call in Canada cultural communities. And in some constituencies that would normally go liberal, where Ukrainian Canadians are concentrated, these constituencies flipped. But then they went back liberal under Justin Trudeau.
And of course, Canada's Deputy Prime Minister and Finance Minister, Chrystia Freeland, is an important member of that community in Canada.
Absolutely. She actually grew up in Edmonton, and a proud Canadian Ukrainian mother. The father was Scottish, but she culturally is Canadian Ukrainian. And well, now she's a Toronto MP. And obviously, she's the highest ranking ever Canadian Ukrainian in the Canadian government, although more symbolically, as a head of state, Canada had a fourth generation Canadian Ukrainian in the 1990s, Governor General Ray Natishin, who came from the West, and his ancestors came from actually the Romanian Ukrainian areas, a different part of Western Ukraine.
Fascinating. Thank you for that, Professor Arel. Dr. Bolden, let me turn now to you. Canada was one of the first Western countries, the first Western country, I believe, to recognize the independence of Ukraine in 1991. What role did Canadians play in those early years of Ukrainian independence, and why?
Yes, so Canada was one of the first to recognize Ukraine as independent, and that came on the heels of an already fairly strong, in the context, bilateral engagement between Canada and the Ukraine, even as the Soviet Union was coming apart. I'll just give a little context here to the broader conditions of Canadian foreign policy, which is that Canada is a unique country in many ways, and one of them is that it's not Europe, but deeply tied to Europe. It's not the US, but deeply tied to the US. In the North American context, right, those ties are hugely significant, and is a massive country with a small population. 80-something% lives within 100 kilometers, 60 miles of the Canadian border. So we have this massive landmass, and we don't have the capacity physically to protect it. And so for all those reasons, the reasons I'm walking through this, for all those reasons, Canadian foreign policy is driven by a concern for international stability, and the phrase we often hear these days, but on and off over the past, since post-Cold War period in particular, a rules-based order. And so Canadian foreign, if you want to understand Canadian foreign policy, you can think first of those characteristics, and it's going to give you a lot of insight into particular decisions. And that's the case here. So Canada has and had particular connections with Ukraine, but in that context of the Soviet Union coming apart, the end of the Cold War, some of its overarching goals were really about order and stability in that region in particular. And the ties with Ukraine led it to engage in particular with them to talk about things like making, quote unquote, the right decisions about nuclear weapons and signing up to international agreements, respecting human rights, becoming democratic. So all of that discussion had been going on and continued to go on behind the scenes as Ukraine is working towards independence, and then as it has its referendum at the beginning of December. And so the day after the referendum, because there'd been this prelude of contact and negotiations, Canada recognized the results of the referendum right away. I think Poland might have been the other state to do so quickly, naturally, being Ukraine's next door neighbor. And Canada had been working and has over time on and off been working with Poland vis-a-vis Ukraine as well. So there's that backdrop that began the process that led to Canada being right up front in terms of recognition.
Mm-hmm. And Fast forward just about a little more than 10 years, many people in the United States, here in North America, I guess say more broadly, took notice of Ukraine in 2004 when the so-called Orange Revolution occurred following an election that brought Viktor Yanukovych in as the president. Let me start with you, Dr. Bolden, and then move over to you, Dr. Harel, to get a sense of the Orange Revolution, how it was perceived by Canada, the government of, and the Ukrainian Canadian community. Was it a moment of engagement or concern? How would you characterize that moment in Canada's relationship with Ukraine?
As between the two, I think it was more a moment of concern than anything else. Although, as with everything between Canada and the Ukraine, there's always a mix of motivations going on. The concern aspect was with the election and the irregularities of the election. Canada had given a lot of, I'm just hedging there because some people didn't think it was enough, but significant support in terms of providing election monitoring and engaging with the process in an effort to make the election as viable as possible. And when that translated into a decision that, or a recognition that there had been significant irregularities, Canada went with that decision and said unanimously in the House of Commons that the democratic will of the Ukrainian people had to be respected, and then contextualize that in saying that Canada would work with international institutions. Goes back to the core idea that Canada looks for stability and a rules-based order in order to move forward from there. So Canada's always been very supportive of a democratic Ukraine and the election process in general. That's a set of characteristics that apply to its relationship with other countries as well. So the election going off the rails, as it were, or being questionable was a big moment of concern for Canada.
And Professor Harel, how did that moment, the Orange Revolution, resonate within the Canadian-Ukrainian community?
Oh, this was a catalyzing, very energizing moment, a pivotal moment. I would say, because there was a huge organization, but I would say in concert, this was in a sense the coming out of Ukrainians at on the national stage, if not in the international stage, because for a little while, this was the #1 story. Of course, we can compare to what's going on right now in 2022, when it's 24/7 Ukraine and all over the world. It was the kind of the Ukrainian question taking center stage in Canadian politics in an interesting way. If you compare it to, let's say, Germany, that has until last week kind of an ambiguous and contested relations vis-a-vis Russia. Whereas in Canada, you never had that from 2004 on. The reality is, because of the electoral weight, I would say, of the Canadian-Ukrainian community and the fact that the elections are highly contested in Canada, and we've got 4 or 5 parties getting seats, and many more often than before, we have minority governments, so each seat counts. So you've got maybe a dozen seats nationally where the Canadian-Ukrainian vote counts. And what happened in 2004, it's been repeated ever since, is kind of a unanimity among all the major Canadian parties that they're all in on Ukraine. There is no question that we have to be careful because of our interest towards Russia and so forth. It is really, in that sense, a concerted efforts. If the government, or back then, was criticized by the oppositions, that was by not having done enough, as opposed to maybe we're losing kind of our neutrality, perhaps, between Canada and Ukraine. So in terms of not doing enough, yes, the election, the second round of election back then was fraudulent. Basically, the incumbent fabricated almost 1 million votes and to try to win. That was the first attempt by President Putin to really bring Ukraine back in by basically violating its competitive elections, and it failed. But Canada, it was symbolic, reacted when eventually, after mobilization, the decision was made by the court to go to an extraordinary third round of election, saying that the second round had been basically incorrect. Canada sent 500 international observers, an entire plane load, which kind of overwhelmed the OSCE capacity to. So it was very symbolic, but I would say then Ukraine became the national story in Canada, and then that was repeated twice, Maidan and the current situation.
Let me pick up, you mentioned Vladimir Putin, and really after 2004, there was tension involved, and it, in some ways, even now we're talking about the famous NATO summit in Bucharest in 2008, when there was discussion of Ukraine joining NATO. Let me start with you, Professor Arel. How is that understood? As a firm commitment, as something that Canada supported in the Ukrainian Canadian community? Does that sense that Ukraine could join NATO really still count with the Ukrainian Canadians? Do they still hold out the hope that Ukraine could join?
Well, obviously we're taping this 1 week into the war. I mean,
yeah,
they keep asking for a no-fly zone, which would essentially mean we want NATO intervention, and which, if it happens, then we're going to get a direct war with Russia. But going back to 2008, the United States and then Canada was in concert with the Bush administration, really pushed for Ukraine and Georgia to become NATO members. But the European major states, France and Germany, were very hesitant, and then there was pushback from Putin. So at the summit, they came up with this literally untenable compromise, which was a declaration that Ukraine and Georgia will become NATO members, but no timetable. And so they never got into the track of candidate membership until to fulfill all the qualifications, which in practice have meant up until like 2022, for nearly 15 years, everybody understood that they had no chance in the foreseeable future. It was not on the political agenda, but it was on the very official piece of paper that Ukraine one day would join NATO. Of course, Russia seized on that's a security threat and so forth. But Canada and the US pushed for that, perhaps in part because of the electoral dynamics, which makes it basically kind of all in on Ukraine. Whereas in Europe, the traditional concern, at least until 2022, was try to balance out Russian interest and Ukrainian interest.
Thank you for that, Dr. Bolden. I know in the United States, particularly in those George W. Bush years, there was a real commitment to democracy and the spread of democracy abroad, but the Canadian government took maybe a slightly different emphasis. How would you describe the government of Canada's view about that NATO summit and about the NATO pledge?
So yeah, slightly different view. So Canada's support for Ukraine vis-a-vis NATO goes way back, well before 2008, as part of Canada's effort to stabilize or to help stabilize and secure Ukraine as it moved forward from the end of the Cold War. And Canada acted, mediator maybe isn't quite the right word, but as a go-between between Ukraine and NATO members in those earlier days, helping to establish the idea that it would be a good idea to reach out to Ukraine and others as well, but Canada was particularly focused on Ukraine, and engage them at least, in some minimal and eventually larger partnership for peace and other kinds of NATO programs as a way of helping them to find their feet and to become more democratic and secure, which would by extension help European and thus international security more broadly. I mean, at one point, I think even the Ukraine mission to NATO was housed in the Canadian embassy in Brussels, just to give a sense of how much, sort of informal / slightly formal support Canada was giving to that relationship. So it was strongly supportive as we get into 2008 of Ukraine membership. But I would guess that even by I would hazard a guess anyway, that even by 2008 in the summit, Canada knew where it was going to go, which is that the European states were hesitant. And it goes to Dominique's point, right, that there's, and this is the case all the way along, in any year you want to pick in the relationship, Canada's always themselves trying to balance the relationship with Ukraine against relationship with the Russians and with NATO members more broadly. So while Ukraine, all in for Ukraine, absolutely, but always that balancing act. So I think once we get to 2008 and after, there's a kind of settling into, okay, this is going to be how it is moving forward. And so the connections with NATO continue in various forms, but as Dominic said, everybody kind of knew what the writing on the wall was different than the writing on the formal piece of paper.
Thank you for that. Now, correct me if I'm wrong, but in 2010, Viktor Yanukovych is elected as president of Ukraine and begins to unwind. By 2013, he's rejecting Ukraine becoming a member of the European Union, which had been talked about, and rejected Ukraine as a member of NATO in an attempt, I think, to reassure the Russians. How did the government of Canada respond to that policy shift? And did it see that as a legitimate shift to perhaps seeing that balancing you were talking about, Dr. Bolden, as being the primary goal, and now with this move needing to balance in a different manner?
So one of the things that happens as we head into 2013 is that we're in a situation with the Harper government, Prime Minister Harper at the time, whose foreign policy does take a slightly different tact on foreign policy in at the more specific level. The broader principles are all still there, but under the Harper government, we see much more of a focus on values as being interests, in effect, in the context of Canada's national interests. And so there's a rights-based and a freedom-based set of assumptions that underpin the Harper approach to foreign policy generally. That is running alongside an interesting pullback under the Harper government over some time at the international level, less focus on the UN, less focus on some of the international institutions in the traditional way we associate with Canada. So when we get to 2013, it is one of the other catalyst moments, pivotal moments for change or for motivation in Canadian foreign policy. Canada ends up taking a strong position based on democratic rights and freedom associated with what's going on with the protests and the election there.
Professor Arel, you actually raised these protests. I think they're associated with the Maidan, the square in Kyiv. Can you talk a little bit about how the Maidan protests were viewed by Ukrainian Canadians? Were they on side with the protesters, or did they take a more complicated view of the situation at the time?
Sure. Let me just backtrack a bit.
Sure.
So that it's clear. The NATO question, the Yanukovych government, actually Yanukovych was elected in a free election in 2010, contrary to the previous attempt, and immediately declared that basically Ukraine was no longer pursuing NATO. That reflected kind of the ambivalence of Ukrainian public opinion, largely along regional lines, kind of west and east. So you didn't have a strong consensus by any means for Ukraine joining NATO. It was very contested back then. It's no longer the case, obviously. So the issue was really the EU, not to formally join the EU, but to sign this trade agreement, but which was overwhelmingly seen by the pro-European constituency in Ukraine as the antechamber, basically, of the EU. So the trade deal, even though it's hard economics, was seen in terms of we want to be European, we want to live in a in a state based on the rule of law, etc. So that's the freedom part that Jane mentioned, that the Harper government, again, partly for electoral reasons, because that was very, very appealing to Ukrainian Canadian constituency, move forward to. So we get to Maidan in this last-minute decision under massive Russian pressure, most likely Russian blackmail, to stop not to sign the trade agreement that had been negotiated for years, which unleashed the Maidan, which within a week was basically the site of police brutality, excessive violence, which now completely transformed the nature of the demonstration. I mean, you still had Europe in a sense of this notion that we want not to be like Russia. We don't want to live in an autocracy. We want to live in as a free, normal European state. But also it became, we want to live also in a state that dignifies us. It was the revolution of dignity. We don't want to be beaten up arbitrarily by the police. And that was the kind of how the demonstrations came to be seen, and almost unanimously by the Ukrainian community, in as much as they're mobilized in Canada, view Maidan, again, as a repeat attempt by Russia or pro-Russian forces to forcibly bring back, so to speak, Ukraine in the Russian orbit. So it's kind of a stage play in three parts, but each time in increased intensity. And the Orange Revolution was entirely peaceful. Maidan got violent on the square and did in a massacre, and then unleashed a war. And we're going to get to 2022 soon. But always this idea of Ukraine wants to be free from the grips of Russia.
I do want to get to the current crisis, but I really feel that history is very useful in sort of setting the stage. So thank you very much for that. With regard to the current crisis, over to you, Dr. Bolden. How has Canada responded? What kind of assistance has Canada pledged, and what more do you think could emerge in the future, both in terms of military development, any other kind of assistance that Canada might offer?
Right. So yeah, there's a variety of paths in which we can unpack this. So politically, verbally, Canada's response has been very strong right off the top. That probably reflects a little, but not at all fully, the role of Chrystia Freeland, who we've already spoken about, right, as the Deputy Prime Minister, and as a strong connections to Ukraine. But even if we take that doesn't account for the full picture, and the full picture includes a very strong political statements, strong support in terms of imposing sanctions, which have been gradually increased as events and time have gone on. Very clear indication of support for NATO on the military side. So Canada has already had, since 2016, troops deployed in Latvia as part of a broader preventive deployment, if you like, for lack of a better phrase, in response really to 2014, in effect, and the invasion of Crimea. Canada, not only them, but other NATO allies as well, ramping up their support and their deployment, their forward deployment of troops to send signals to Russia about resolve on that borderline through Europe. We've now added to that so there's 540 troops in Latvia at the moment. There's a frigate in the area. There are additional troops coming, and there are 3,400 troops on standby for NATO generally, still kind of waiting to see whether those will be called up or pulled into use. There's also electronic warfare unit that's gone over. So militarily, we've done a number of things in terms of boots on the ground or possible boots on the ground. The other aspect is the arms support, lethal arms support. And we have just this week seen the government commit to sending anti-tank weapons and rockets. We may see more of that as time goes on. On the other side of the equation, there's the question of humanitarian assistance and refugees. And in the past few days, the government has taken some heat on that issue in that they have been unwilling to waive a visa requirement for Ukrainian citizens. And just in the last 24, 48 hours, they've come up with an alternative in order to try to fast track the ability of Ukrainians who want to come to Canada to come. Leaving the visa issue aside, I think there's more they could do there, honestly. And I think there's precedence in that respect. I think back to the Kosovo, the events around Kosovo, when Canada took in thousands of refugees, housed them at armed forces bases, brought them into the community in other ways as well. And I know events are moving quickly, so in a way it's unfair to say, they could have done more sooner, but it isn't unfair in other ways. I think there is more that could be done on that score. We've just today seen, just before we came on, I saw on the news that there's some basic agreement about humanitarian corridors that's resulted from these talks. So there's two elements to that, a separate one being humanitarian aid in general that Canada could provide and likely, will ramp up, but there may be specific things we can do now that these humanitarian corridors are in play. Yeah, so I think I've covered most of the bases there.
No, that's very helpful. And Professor Arel, just building on that, Canada has a large number of fluent Ukrainian speakers, actually, as part of this community. Is there a role for Ukrainian Canadians here as volunteers with human rights organizations or refugee groups supporting frontline states like Poland, or perhaps moving in with programs? We've even heard in recent days of sort of an international brigade of individual volunteers who are trying to go and join the fighting. How would you characterize where the Ukrainian Canadian community is on some of those options? Are they jumping into the fore, or are they there as a resource that could be part of an international response in a constructive way?
The Canadian Ukrainian community is by far the better organized in the world in the Ukrainian diaspora. The numbers may be higher in Russia in terms of the number of Ukrainians, and many of them seasonal workers, but they're not organized, or they cannot be organized because you can't organize a civil society in Russia under Putin. So it is quite extraordinary. Already they were mobilized. I mean, I mentioned the act in 3 steps and the Orange Revolution, Maidan, and of course Maidan followed by the annexation of Crimea and what was then the ongoing war in Donbass. Just Monday, I attended a meeting of the UCC, the Ukrainian Canadian Congress, Ottawa branch, and it was all about let's coordinate what we can do locally and then coordinate that with the national institution. It was very impressive. We've got a foundation. They have a foundation called the Canada-Ukraine Foundation, which within days raised $3 million, and their objective is 5 million. And they're working on immigration, and they're working on sending, of course, money and lobbying the government. And they have certainly the enthusiasm. Now they have, when I said it became a national story, now it's a world story, but in Canada, the media is mobilized 24/7. And so it's far more than Canadian Ukrainians that are getting into it. But just at the level of organization, this is very impressive, both working with government and in parallel with government. Now, government itself, I think Jane covered most of the bases. Let me just add the following. One of the issues that Putin kept of course, being frustrated about was, we mentioned it, the NATO, the status, right? Whether Ukraine would join NATO one day. But the reality was that NATO was already in Ukraine. Ukraine was not in NATO, but NATO was. And by that I mean, in part, the presence of military trainers, soldiers who were sent in missions to train the Ukrainian army. Now, Canada was part of that group, and that was actually the largest delegation, even though Canada is kind of a junior partner in, suddenly compared to the United States or other major states. So here you have an example, even if Canada until just a week ago wouldn't go the way of lethal weapons, a bit like Germany, and now they're, I wouldn't say all in, but it's light years away now, and we're sending anti-tank weapons. But you had that mission, which certainly symbolized in the view of Russia the extent to which Canada was, in a sense, pushing de facto the NATO line in Ukraine. And one other aspect in the sanction things that obviously evolve so fast, it's hard to keep track of this changing situation. But Canada actually banned the export of oil, of Russian oil to Canada. It could be that it was made with a calculation that it wouldn't create too much turbulence on oil prices and market in Canada. I can't answer that, but the decision was made, whereas the US and European states, beginning with Germany, have not gone there yet, if ever they will, because that would be perhaps the ultimate sanction, because that's the hard currency earner of the Russian Federation. But again, it's more than symbolically. Canada made the further steps along with the other unprecedented sanctions, regarding SWIFT and the central bank and so forth.
Thank you for that. They're very impressive. I want to turn to you, Dr. Bolden. You mentioned earlier, I think, the United Nations, and Canada is often seen as a middle power, as a country that works well within the international rule of law system, the international organizations, institutions, the United Nations, NATO, other multilateral bodies. What might we expect from Canadian foreign policy here in those particular bodies? Could Canada be something of a leader or a coalition builder in the international community in key organizations that could bring additional pressure to bear on Russia, or at least contribute to an end in the conflict that would be good for Ukraine?
Yeah, that's a good and difficult question in a way from a Canadian perspective, because I think that your characterization is absolutely correct, and that under this government, and the current ambassador to the UN is Bob Rae, there's been a real engagement with the UN on Canada's part, in contrast to, I think I mentioned before, under the Harper government, there'd really been a downplaying and deprioritization of the UN as a tool for Canada. So we have seen, and would expect to see, Canada playing a role there. During the emergency session, which was earlier this week, Canada was one of the key players, trying to get as many states on side as possible to the resolution that emerged from that General Assembly meeting. But the bottom line is that the structure of the United Nations, in particular the structure of the Security Council, means that the UN is very sidelined in this. Russia, as a permanent member, has a veto. I would argue it's still important as a venue. It's still highly desirable that representatives of all the countries, Russia included, are sitting around the table. And even though the words are heated, they are at least sitting around the table, exchanging views and talking about what's happening. In terms of multilateral institutions, I think at the moment, from a Canadian perspective, NATO's the key, for all kinds of reasons. One is that's what's being most threatened, and is also the source of threat in Putin's mind that has prompted all this. It's also an area in which Canada can and has played a lead role vis-a-vis the Ukraine, as I was describing a bit earlier. But even leaving aside the bilateral relationship, Canada can also play a key role within NATO in terms of trying to bring, to the extent needed, and luckily we're not seeing huge rifts in NATO at the moment, but to the extent needed, trying to bring states on side for as strong a collective response as possible. And that's where Canada can excel and has excelled in the past just in general. I would just, because it links a little bit to the point you raised earlier about Ukrainians and language speakers and so on, point to a specific way in which sometimes that plays out, which is there was a report a few weeks ago about when Poroshenko came back to the Ukraine, about the fact that it was Chrystia Freeland, as well as Prime Minister Trudeau, but apparently she was the linchpin, on the phone with Zelensky, and in her case, speaking Ukrainian to him, to convince him of the importance of not arresting Poroshenko, of trying to keep things as stable and unified as possible within Ukraine as they were heading into this crisis. So there's, there's the unpredictable aspect of these things sometimes. And Canada, you said, can Canada play a specific role in trying to bring this thing to an end? I mean, maybe, and in ways that we can't imagine in advance. But yes, in the traditional ways as well of playing that kind of behind the scenes interlocutor state amongst other states who have differing views, and the goal is to bring them together on a collective position.
And I'll just point out for our viewers who may not be familiar, Petro Poroshenko was a past president of Ukraine and accused of corruption, I think, and some other things. And this was the reference you were making. He came back to Ukraine, and current President Zelensky was the person that you were also talking about. Just to
sorry,
sure I've got
I should
that
have spelled that out.
No. I've been in Washington a long time. We usually use acronyms nobody understands, so I just want to make sure everybody follows along. I guess a final question to you both, and that is, where do we go from here? I mean, obviously things have been moving very rapidly. None of us can tell what the situation militarily on the ground is likely to be in the coming days and weeks or even hours. But as we think about the future, how can Canada and Ukraine work together to rebuild after the conflict, to address Ukraine's position in the international community if it's in a position to affiliate with different organizations? What's the future of Canadian-Ukrainian relations? And I ask this in part because so many of our viewers will be Americans and unaware that Canada is a bit of a trump card, an ace in the hole, a valuable member of the U.S. alliance system, with maybe something extra to bring in terms of its close ties to Ukraine that could lead to a constructive end to the situation. With that in mind, Professor Arel, can I start with you?
Well, at one level, it's a question impossible to answer.
I'm sorry.
We're in the most dire of situation. I mean, there's a full-scale war that of the type that we haven't seen in Europe since 1939, when you have basically a major power literally attacking a neighboring state in order to destroy its sovereignty. I'm referring, of course, to the invasion of Poland by Germany in 1939, which unleashed World War II, because Poland actually had alliances with Britain and France, whereas Ukraine, well, is an ally, yes, but it was more than an alliance back then. It was like a pact that if you're attacked, it was kind of a mini NATO kind of situation. Mm-hmm. If one member is attacked, it will come to its aid, and that was World War II. And in a sense, we are in World War III, not because NATO has engaged Russia, but because the Western allies are waging unprecedented economic warfare on Russia of a scale that we haven't seen in ever, basically. And that is kind of a very potent tool of war, which may or may not weaken Russian military or Russian resolve, which probably means the resolve of the president, enough, but we don't know. But the situation on the ground could be much, much, much worse than that it is now on March the 3rd, right? So Ukraine could be occupied militarily by Russia, except that it's fairly clear 1 week into the war that the act of war has extinguished any kind of Russian support in Ukraine beginning with Eastern Ukraine and Russian-speaking Ukraine, the areas that in the Russian traditional conception and what Putin repeats constantly is the Russian world, the Ruski Mir that needs to be brought back to Russia. Its former allies are basically shattered because they're being attacked in their own country. So in that context, what can Canada do going forward? We don't have all the scenarios, but again, it's bringing back to the comparative advantage that a middle kind of power Canada has on a field, on a territory, in a country here, which has literally become now the center of the world, of the geopolitical order. Jane mentioned Chrystia Freeland speaking Ukrainian to Zelensky, trying to diffuse a very delicate political situation. That's highly symbolic because she's the deputy prime minister. But I think that kind of behind the scenes, whether it came from the embassy in the Canadian embassy in Kiev during the Orange Revolution, or other actors officially from the government, not officially from civil society, that kind of engagement is unparalleled, proportionally even compared to the Ukrainian-American, let's say, contribution, which is substantial, admittedly. So Canada can continue to play on its advantages in the most, what is the word? Unpredictable and tragic and terrible situation, including the whole humanitarian aspect and most likely disproportionately accepting Ukrainian refugees compared to its, demographic weight because of the historic link with Ukraine.
Dr. Bolden, what do you see as possible or likely in Ukrainian-Canadian relations going forward? Admitting, of course, we don't know what the next days and weeks will bring.
Yeah, one hates to speculate and predict in the current situation. I would hope and imagine that one of the things the government is doing is thinking ahead to a spectrum of scenarios, short term, shorter term, and medium term, and how Canada might play a role in each of them. And what I mean by that, I used a temporal measure there, but I also mean that, okay, what are we going to be able to do if there's not a full victory on Russia's part and we have an ongoing insurgency and Kiev is under siege? What does that mean? What do we do if Ukraine is ultimately militarily occupied by Russia, who claims to annex it? What do we do then? What institutions do we use? What roles do we play? What's our desired outcome? If we completely refuse to accept it, where does that put us? And what kind of avenues, known and unknown, behind the scenes and upfront official, do we use? So, just building on Dominic's point, I think, there's lots of Canada. This is an instance, and there are fewer perhaps of them than there have been in Canada's sort of storied past in foreign policy, but this is an instance where Canada definitely has the capacity and the will to punch above its weight, to play that middle power road. And so hopefully one of the things they're doing behind the scenes is thinking through those alternative scenarios of where we're heading, keeping in mind it's impossible to predict, but so that once things shift to one or another of the sort of major channels forward, we have the ability to hit the ground running with some clear goals and some clear ideas of which NATO, UN, informal friends of groupings, those kinds of approaches that can be used in foreign policy.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that. And I want to thank both of you, Professor Dominic Arel from the University of Ottawa and Dr. Jane Bolden from the Royal Military College of Canada. Together, you've given us a very good picture of Canada's role, both, if you will, emotional, cultural, but also political and economic in the current crisis. And while we don't know what's going to happen next, I do feel that your what you've been able to share with us today will raise the awareness that many people have or didn't have in the past, that Canada is a very important part of this current crisis and has a great role to play going forward, depending on how circumstances unfold. This has been the Hindsight Upfront series of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. Viewers may check out several of the other episodes in this series by clicking on this same page. But for now, thank you all for being with us, and thank you for watching.